All right, welcome back, everybody. For this unit, we're going to be looking at pre-Columbian America. This is obviously the Americas before the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492 and before the consequent colonization of the Americas in the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th century. Now, we haven't spent much time in the Americas up to this point in the class for a number of reasons. One, because with the European colonization of the Americas, most of the existing natural record of pre Columbian civilizations is systematically erased, I guess would be a good word for it, by Europeans as they establish their political and their cultural dominance over the continents. However, part of that also has to do with the fact that in the case of most Native American civilizations, with the exception of some of the larger ones from Meso and South America, there weren't a lot of written languages developed in pre Columbian America. Most of the history of the continent before Europeans arrive is passed down orally. And as we found with groups with like the Mongols, when a society doesn't have written language, it's more difficult for them to leave a lasting cultural impact or a lasting historical record. So, in terms of the supplemental viewing, always crash course. I would also recommend the Khan Academies. A lot of very good detail in there. My personal favorite on here is the three creation myths. It gives you an excellent insight into the Mesoamerican and South American view of the world and kind of a precursor to their religious views, which is a topic that's pretty regularly tested by the College Board. And I'll just tell you now that I know that it's going to be tested on your unit test. Now, the last time we really looked at the Americas was way back in Unit 1 and Unit 2 when we were still talking about the early human migrations, right? So most of the migrations to the Americas, and again, some of these are under debate, especially that second migration, happen long before the development of what we would consider civilization in Mesopotamia and the Indus River Valley and those early pre-classical civilizations. So in the Americas, what you see is a significantly different environment with significantly different flora and fauna. And this leads to significant disadvantages on the part of Native American civilizations when they come into contact with Europeans, mainly the lack of domesticated animals, the lack of being able to work with iron and steel, and being relegated to stone tools. Not only that, but because of the lack of the domesticated animals, you see a severe deficiency in modes of travel. In Native America, the wheel is not a particularly useful invention because there are very few domesticated animals capable of carrying the weight of a human or carrying the weight of large amounts of goods. The wheel is more used in terms of processing corn. It's used in children's toys, but as a mode of travel, it really isn't sufficient or necessarily what Native American civilizations even need. Now, one of the things I want to hit on at the very start here, and hopefully you keep these in mind throughout, is for all of the disadvantages that Native Americans have, don't be fooled into thinking that Native America was primitive or savage, okay? There are many misconceptions. There's a lot of romanticized ideas about colonization and that whole process, and just flat outright lies. So I want to address some of those to start with. Number one is the idea of the noble savage. that when Europeans got here, Native Americans were just these uncivilized hunter gatherer groups roaming the land, with no effort and no attempts to build large scale civilizations. And somehow this myth comes into place, and it helps to justify the idea that Europeans were meant to come to the Americas, that this was a calling or a mission from God, and that part of their mission was to civilize these savage heathens that lived in, the Americas. The next misconception that I want to address is the idea of this unspoiled wilderness. That when Europeans got here, somehow the Americas were just this untouched Garden of Eden, and Native Americans lived in harmony with nature, that there was just this perfect existence, because that's just simply not true. Native Americans modified and moved and changed the land on the same scale that Europeans did. Um, Now, the lack of iron tools and the lack of domesticated animals meant that this wasn't as widespread as it was in Europe, but that doesn't change the fact that Native Americans absolutely were able to alter the land to suit their needs, building irrigation, building bridges, roads, etc. Um, this wasn't something where, Europeans got off the boat and everyone was running through the forest naked. I mean, it's just simply not the way that it was. Another very romanticized myth about the Americas is that somehow this is the promised land. That the Americas were just lying there in wait, waiting for some powerful, superior Europeans to show up and just claim it as their own. There's also this myth that Native Americans just kind of willingly moved and resettled themselves off of the land because they were so in awe of Europeans and all of their wonderful technology and things like that. And it's just simply not the case. Native Americans resisted encroachment by Europeans fiercely. And if it hadn't been for European diseases ravaging the population, more than likely, Europeans would have been pushed back into the ocean within the first decade of colonization. Um, the other myth that I want to address is the whole Thanksgiving myth. This idea that Native Americans just welcomed the settlers with open arms and that they live in peace and harmony side by side. And that is simply just not the case. As with any invasion, and that's essentially what it was an invasion. At first, the two sides were essentially standoffish. Um, and really kind of stayed isolated from one another. But as more Europeans begin coming to the Americas and begin encroaching deeper and deeper into the land, the Native Americans are forced to react to this, and hence the Europeans react to them. And this whole idea of, side by side cooperation and I'll help you and you help me, I mean, it just really didn't happen that way. It's a wonderful idea and it makes for a wonderful holiday, but it really is not truthful. And then the last idea that I want to address is this myth of the returning God. And this is a pretty popular one. This is the idea that Native Americans somehow fell at the feet of Europeans and just simply handed over the keys to their civilizations and didn't resist because they had this belief that the Europeans were gods returning to their land, and that somehow they had mythical powers, and that these poor, ignorant, superstitious Native Americans just, laid down at the sight of Europeans. And that's just simply not true. I mean, there are examples, one in particular of the Aztec ruler Montezuma, who delayed his response to Hernan Cortez and his initial party of Europeans because of a Aztec legend of a returning god. But that dispersed rather quickly once Cortez and his men arrived in the capital of Tenochtitlan, you know, that rumor dispersed rather quickly, and it was pretty clear to the Native Americans that these were just men, that they were men from a different place and had amazing and unsettling technology, but they were just men nonetheless.